Hey everybody, it's Courtney, and today's video is part of the MFT and Friends for the June 2020 release. And today I'm going to be using the Sunny Vibes stamp set to create a one-layer scene. And I am going to take you guys step by step because I get a ton of questions about one-layer scenes. So for me, what's easiest is I cut my masks first. Not only do I kind of prime the stamps because most of the time they're brand new, but I also get to use the masks as placement. So I am using a piece of Simon Says stamp masking paper here, and you can stamp these as close together as you want. You don't have to worry about using a die or anything. Now you can cut your masks with a scan and cut. I have a scan and cut. I don't prefer to use it for masks just because I feel like I can get a better cut by fussy cutting them myself. But that's totally up to you. If you're not into fussy cutting, you can certainly try your scan and cut. Just keep in mind that you may have some jagged edges sometimes, and those areas can always be fixed. And we definitely have to fix some areas up later on, and you will see that. So for my fussy cutting, I prefer to cut my masking paper into small little sections. So I cut around each one of the images one at a time, so that way I don't have any excess paper, or a lot of excess paper anyway, that I have to worry about. Now you'll see that I am right-handed, so I am cutting obviously with my right hand, and I'm keeping my scissors pretty straight, and I'm turning the paper with my left hand, or my less dominant hand. And for me, this gives me a better cut. I am cutting directly on the black line. If you happen to leave any white edges, you can always kind of trim those areas off. But again, I'll show you how to fix those areas up once we finish up the ink blending. So for the images that have little gaps in between, like this little guy that's holding the umbrella, I'm going to first start by cutting him, the outline of him, just like I did with this little car. But for the gaps between like his little hand and the umbrella itself, you can always fill this in with a marker. But if it's a larger gap and you don't necessarily want to do that, cut right through your mask. It's fine, as long as it stays in one piece. And even if it doesn't stay in one piece, you can always kind of mush them together as you're masking your images. But I usually just cut through, cut around that blank area, and it still stays in one piece. And honestly, it's not too hard to line up once you actually do your stamping. So I went ahead and cut out the rest of the images. I'm not going to show you all of the fussy cutting because it is a little repetitive. But once they were all done, I am going to take a panel of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I am going to use my masks to kind of get an idea of the placement of all of my images. Now this car would naturally be much bigger than my little characters here. So I'm going to put that kind of in the background because the further back it gets, the smaller it will appear. And I'm just going to kind of line things up. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to pop this into my MISTI, keeping my masks right in place. Then I have to take a look at what images are in front of another. So I have this little pail here of the little shovel and whatever, those things that you need to build a sandcastle. That's a little bit in front of my little bunny. So I'm going to line that up. I am also going to take this little umbrella. I think it's supposed to be a dog. We're going to call it a dog. And this little cooler here, because these are images that are in front. I'm going to close my MISTI door, remove the rest of the masks that I used for placement, and I can go ahead and stamp these first set of images down. I am using blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, but whatever Copic safe ink or alcohol marker safe ink that you have is fine. I did end up stamping mine twice just because I like that bold black outline. And then I can mask these first sets of images out. So you'll see that I'm going to start with a more intricate area, which is this umbrella. And then you'll find that as you move your way down, it kind of just lines up it by itself. It's easier than it looks, I promise. So went ahead and masked out the other two images here. Then I can go on to my next set of images. So basically the layer, I guess you could say, behind this. So I'm going to line up this little bunny because that's going to be behind the pail, but in front of the little character in the chair. So I want to stamp that bunny first. Then I want to stamp the car because the car is going to be in front of the palm trees. Went ahead and again stamped these twice with that same blackout ink and masked those out, and we'll move on to the next row or the next layer of images. So I have 2 palm trees that I plan on using, but there's only one image. So I'm going to stamp the first one kind of towards the front of the car, as well as this little character that is sitting in the chair that will be slightly behind the bunny. So went ahead, did the same thing, stamped this twice, stamped these 2 images twice and masked those out. And then finally I can finish off with that last palm tree that's kind of towards the back of the car. Most of it is going to be behind the car, so you're really only going to see the top portion of the tree, but I am going to mask that out as well. Now that all of our images are stamped and masked out, we can work on the background. And I'm going to be doing some ink blending, but you can certainly use alcohol markers or watercolor or whatever you prefer. So for the back of the ocean, I guess you could say, if you look at an ocean scene, just Google it. Anytime you're doing a scene, you can always Google it. Where the ocean meets the sky, it's pretty much a straight line. So I'm going to use my grid mat, my work surface here, and a piece of Post-it note tape just to make sure that it is completely straight, and that I'm just going to mask out my sky to begin with. And I'm going to start by adding my blues for the ocean itself. Now, I'm not doing any masking on the bottom portion of the scene because where the water meets the sand, there's usually not a harsh line there. They're going to kind of merge together. So I'm not worried about doing any masking there. Now for the ocean, I'm going to be using some Distress Oxides. I'm going to start off with the Chipped Sapphire, and this is going to be towards the top portion of my card panel or the back portion of the ocean itself. The further back the water gets, the darker it's going to appear. Again, if you have trouble kind of with the placement or the color or the gradient, I should say, just Google an ocean scene or a beach scene and you can get a pretty good idea. So I blended that out with the Faded Jeans and then the Stormy Sky towards the bottom. And I did add a second layer just to get these colors to blend a little bit more. I usually go over my ink blended backgrounds twice, and this gives me a better blend. Now for the sand, I'm going to switch over to a regular distress ink, and I'm going to be using Antique Linen. And all I'm going to do is add a little bit of color here. I'm not going to use more than one color. I'm not going to use different amounts of it. I'm just adding color. And the reason why I'm using regular distress ink for the sand is because I plan on adding Copics over it. And Copics and Distress Oxides don't really mix that well. It's not going to necessarily ruin your nib because I've done it before, and I know a lot of people say it ruins your nib. I haven't had a problem with that, but it won't blend and it won't look nice. You'll get kind of a muddy mess. So I brought the Antique Linen up to that Stormy Sky, and then I can remove this Post-it note tape. And now I want to do my sky with broken, no, did I use broken china? No, I used tumbled glass. I believe I used tumbled glass. So I'm taking another piece of Post-it note tape here, and I don't know whether you can see it on camera, but I have just a teeny tiny bit of that dark blue showing. And that's just because sometimes when the mask is raised up a little bit, no matter how thin it is. So you want a little bit of that darker blue to be peeking through, or else you might have a white outline that separates the ocean and the sky, and that doesn't look good. So went ahead and added that tumbled glass, and I did let this sit for just a couple of minutes while my ink kind of dries a little bit, and then I can remove the mask. And I typically don't put this in the video, but I know that I get a lot of comments that this is like your favorite part or some of your favorite parts. So I left this in the video. Now I am using the tip of my scissors to get my masks started. They're pretty saturated, especially where the Distress Oxides were. So if your masks start to rip as you're removing them, let them rip. You can always go back and remove those little pieces that have ripped off, but if you try to save the mask, you may end up sacrificing the card panel itself, and that's very hard to fix. So let the mask rip. You can always go back and fix that area up. So once all my masks were removed, we're going to move on to the Copic coloring. Again, because this video is so long, I was going to kind of skip through most of the coloring, but again, you guys prefer to see it. So I left it all in, but I sped it up a lot, which I don't normally do, but in order to keep this video, and I can't even say short, but within a viewable amount of time, I had to speed it up a little bit. So I'm starting with the E30 markers, and I'm just adding dots underneath each one of my images and kind of off to the right-hand corner just because that area is kind of blank. And this is going to add some texture to my grass, but it's also going to add a shadow underneath each one of my images. So it's not just that plain antique linen, which is kind of boring looking. So this just adds a little texture as well as some dimension. So I'm also going to use those E30s for this little sandcastle here. I'm not worried about a light source for this one. We kept this nice and simple. I know that scenes are intimidating, but I promise you guys, you can do this. It's not as hard as it looks. So next we're going to move on to this, some cool grays. And this little cooler here. And I want this to be like a light gray, but it is still going to have a little bit of dark shading on either side. While I have those cool gray markers out, I'm also going to color the top portion of these little cups that are sticking out. Now, I'm keeping a strong center highlight for those because they are a round object. For the bunny, I'm going to bring out some W markers or warm gray markers. My warm grays are pretty dry, so pretty much the only ones I have are the W3 and the W1. So I added a little bit of shading on either side, but I'm using my colorless blender to kind of make it fade to white. So it looks like a white bunny, but anything white still does have some shadows to it. So next, moving on to this little dog here, I'm going to move on to some E70 markers. I'm starting off with the lightest color just to get my paper saturated. I'm not really worried about placing down my shadows because it's a center highlight and they're pretty easy to, it's pretty easy to put down a center highlight. You just add shadows to either side. But these colors don't necessarily blend that well together. So I want to make sure that the paper is nice and saturated. The more the paper is saturated, the better blend you're going to get. You just want to be careful not to oversaturate it, because if you oversaturate it, you may see that your colors will bleed a little bit. So next I'm going to move on to the, I guess it would be tree trunks. The palm tree trunks, is that what they're called for palm trees? I don't know, but I'm just adding a little bit of shading for each one of these little sections with the E50 markers, and I'm only using 3 colors here. Now for this other little character that's sitting in the chair, I honestly don't know what it's supposed to be. At first I thought it was a raccoon at first because of the striped tail, but then realized he didn't have those little, like the mask looking face that raccoons have. So I ended up bringing in some E markers and YR markers, and I kind of just colored it the way I wanted to. Whenever you don't know what something is, just color it whatever you want. It's your card. You can make anything, any object, anything you want it to be. So I'm not really too concerned or stressed out about it. So by using the E markers, it kind of brings in a little bit of a brown tone, but still has that orangey reddish tone to it as well. And you'll see that I am coloring directly over where his glasses are too. And we're going to add some little extra shine and dimension to those once all of the coloring is complete. So now that my characters are done, now I can move on to the brighter colors, I guess you could say. We're going to add some color to this. I'm going to start off with the greens for the palm tree. I'm starting right with my darkest color because I want to maintain those flick lines. It just adds a little texture. And you can see that I'm adding some flick lines to the base of each one of these leaves and to the tip of the leaves as well. So I'm keeping the center for the highlight, and that's just going to give it a little bit of shape. It's going to look like they're kind of bowed out a little bit. And I'm only using a 3-color blend here. Now, while I have these greens out, I'm also going to color in this little pail with the same color combination. Again, it's a round object, so I'm keeping a pretty strong center highlight. Now, for the handle itself, you just want to be super careful. Use the very tip of your marker, keep your marker straight up and down, and that's how you can get into those little teeny tiny areas. So next I'm going to bring in my yellow combination. I'm going to color in every other stripe of this umbrella. Again, I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the bottom as well as the base of the umbrella because this is a bowed out object. So the part that's bowed out, I guess you could say, is going to be the brightest or the lightest. Also going to color in this little stripe on the surfboard, and I'm just using one color for this little, it's not a shovel. It's kind of like a, I don't know what it's called, but you see. I'm not going to bother to do any shading to it because I'm not going to risk it bleeding. So next, moving on to a BG combination, going to color in the remaining stripes of the umbrella the same way. This I'm only using 3 different colors just because I don't have a 4th that goes along well with these colors. And I feel like I get enough contrast with these 3 colors anyway. Colored the chair with the same combination as well as the handle of that shovel inside the pail. Next, going to move on to the pink combination. I am starting with my lightest color for this one because pinks RV markers can be tough to blend sometimes. And you'll see that once it sits for a little bit, like right now it looks good. And I'm going to move on to the car and use the same color combination. But as it sits, it seems to like, I don't know, maybe as the paper dries, it seems to show how bad the blend really was. So once I had the car complete and realized that those weren't blending too well either, and it was mainly the RV14 and the RV11, I ended up using the tip-to-tip method just to get those colors to blend a little bit. Didn't really have a problem with the darker colors. It was mainly just that highlight color, but using the tip-to-tip technique really seems to help with the blending. So next, going to move on to the book. Again, I'm going to bring in those E50 markers that I used for the trees, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading where the book is actually, like the binding of the book, where it would be bent or open. You know what I mean. So next, going to move on to the glasses. Again, I'm going to use R17 or RV17, which is scary, but you want to make sure that that marker's straight up and down. Also going to color one of these cups with that same color combination. And next, going to bring in a V combination. And I'm pretty much coloring everything the same exact way, guys. It's not really... You're not really going to learn too much as far as the coloring goes, but I did want to keep it in. I know you guys enjoy watching the coloring, and you can always get an idea of different color combinations to use. So next, I am going to bring in my C markers. And for these wheels or for these tires, I'm just going to use the C7 as my darkest. They would technically be black, but I didn't necessarily want to bring black into the card. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to blend out, and I didn't, again, want to risk that bleeding. So now that everything is colored in, we can fix up our masking mistakes and also fill in some of these areas that you would normally be able to see through. So the sides of his glasses, I'm going to use some B markers that will match what would be behind it. Also going to fill in these little white highlight or white outline areas where my masks either weren't perfectly cut or they weren't perfectly lined up. Also filling in the windows of the car because you'd be able to see the ocean through those. Next, I brought in my white gel pen, and I can't say I ruined the card, but I certainly should have left this part out. It works well, I guess, if I had more of an open space, but I'm just kind of making some squiggly lines, and while the ink is still wet, I'm smooshing it with my finger. So it looks like there's kind of waves in the ocean. The background doesn't look so bad, but I wanted to add a little bit more where the water meets the sand, and it just wasn't looking good. Wasn't looking good. I tried to take my blending brush and kind of go over it with the ink that's already on there to kind of soften it a little bit, added a little bit more, and it just was not working at all. But I left it the way it is for now, added some white gel pen details to some of the images, and went back in and added a few more to the ocean once the other ones were dry. Tried to add a little bit more ink on top of it. It toned it down a little bit, but not great. Not great at all. Also didn't like the white gel pen detail that I put on this little dog on his little snout area. So I added the white gel pen detail to the opposite side of him and went over with that E79 on the left-hand side. And that was really the only way you're going to cover it, is if it's a super dark color. So it is what it is. It's not perfect. It's handmade. So it isn't supposed to be perfect. So I'm going to leave it the way it is, stamp out my sentiment with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there on the top portion of my card panel. And finally finished off with some Crystal Glaze by Nuvo over this little guy's glasses, as well as the glass or the windows in the car. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.